The Suzuki GSX-R 1100 was a sport bike from Suzuki's GSX-R series of motorcycles introduced in 1986. Background: in the mid-1970s the motorcycle industry was in a period of transition. Because of noise and pollution, large two-strokes were being banned from the streets in many countries and there was no such thing as a true, four-stroke sport bike. There were sporting four-strokes, of course, but they were, for the most part, derivatives of regular motorcycles, and those that came from Japan were, regardless of manufacturer, almost all the same. Built around an inline four-cylinder air-cooled engine wrapped in a steel double cradle frame, they were so similar, in fact, that they became known as the Universal Japanese Motorcycle. Seeing the handwriting on the wall, Suzuki, which had made its reputation by building two-strokes, built its first large four-stroke bikes, the DOHC GS750 and the GS400, for the American market in 1976. The GS550 arrived soon after, and by 1978 the formidable GS1000 was making jaws drop in showrooms everywhere. 1980 saw the introduction of the 16-valve DOHC engine. It also witnessed the creation of the then extremely radical and influential Suzuki Katana, a bike which stylistically resembles a modern sport bike on the outside, but which was largely underpinned by existing technology of the day, although Suzuki were very quick to adopt the DOHC 16-valve cylinder head with their GSX 1100 range in 1980. In 1983 Honda introduced the VF750 Interceptor, a radically innovative bike that set the trend for modern sport bikes. Kawasaki followed suit in 1984 with its Kawasaki GP-Z900 or Ninja. Suzuki, meanwhile, soldiered on with its very powerful and very torquey but heavy air-cooled 16-valve DOHC GS1100 GSX 1100 EFEG. A very capable machine, but one definitely of its generation, even if it was at the forefront of it. This engine was typically enormously strong. Many Suzuki engines get fully deserved bulletproof reputations, as many drag racers found out. Over 300 bhp was perfectly possible and many ended up being turbocharged and tuned. The GSX 750 ES was well thought of too, especially for its fine handling, but again also was another machine that represented the most refined development of its own current generation. At Suzuki it was felt that something much newer was needed for the future, both in chassis and engine terms. By the mid-1980s the motorcycle industry was in a period of decline. Honda and Yamaha had engaged in a production war in order to decide who would become the world Euro unregistered trademark's largest motorcycle manufacturer, and the result was oversupply. Brand new bikes went unsold and stacked up in warehouses and on dealers' floors. For many years after, consumers could buy new old stock bikes, a previous year's model that had lain in its packing crate for years waiting to be sold, for the fraction of the price of a new bike. Needless to say, production tanked and manufacturers worried about their futures. Development: in the midst of this market, Etsuo Yokochi and his team of designers began work on a bike intended to change the market and outperform Honda Euro unregistered trademark's Interceptor. They began in 1983 on Suzuki Euro unregistered trademark's domestic market Gamma 250 with the goal of producing a lightweight two-stroke for the streets. The RG250 was the world's first production alloy-framed motorcycle. Building upon the success of the Gamma, in 1984 they introduced the four-cylinder, four-stroke, aluminum-framed GSX-R 400 for the Japanese market. A full 18% lighter than comparable bikes on the market, the first GSX-R set the tone for those that would follow. I felt that if we could do a 400cc's bike that was 18% lighter, we should be able to do the same with a 750 inches, recalls Mr. Yokochi. Using a current model GSX 750 ES as a starting point, Yokochi Euro unregistered trademark's team went through every part, reducing weight wherever possible. A new aluminum frame was engineered in a distinctive shape with square tubes stretching back over and around the top of the engine, then turning sharply downwards just past the carburetors to beneath the engine where they met the lower tubes. This design, unheard of at the time, would soon become familiar to a generation of motorcyclists and is often referred to as the A Euro humpback Euroframe. Where welding would have added unnecessary weight, aircraft-quality rivets were used. Weight was shaved back further and further until parts failed in the attempt to work out how much excess bulk could be trimmed away. To save more weight, the suspension was engineered differently from most bikes of the day by mounting the top of the shock solidly to the frame while the bottom was attached to a banana-shaped linkage that housed an eccentric cam below the swing arm. The resulting system was lightweight, made suspension travel progressive and lowered the Bikea Euro 1 registered trademark S overall center of gravity. While the engine used was a dual overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder design typical of most bikes of the era, it had unique features that set it apart from other air-cooled designs of the day. In the GSX-R, oil would be used to cool parts of the engine, like the top of the combustion chamber, which were not typically well served by air cooling alone. In order to provide enough oil for both cooling and lubrication, the team designed a double-chamber pump, using the high-pressure side to lubricate the bearings while the low-pressure, high-volume side provided oil to the cooling circuit. The end result became known as the SACS, Suzuki Advanced Cooling System. The resulting motorcycle was rigorously tested to its breaking point, the weaknesses found and re-engineered until the bugs were worked out. Many of the Bikea Euro 1 registered trademark S non-mechanical design features were dictated by concerns other than pure mechanics. The flat front fascia and trademark dual headlight were incorporated because designers wanted to give the bike the look of an endurance racer and because regulations dictated that the headlight be behind the front axle. The wide plastic panels under the seat were added to hide an unsightly exhaust hanger. The resulting GSX 750 was introduced in 1985 but withheld from the United States due to tariff issues which would have imposed a 39.4% tax on each bike because it was over 700 cc's. By waiting until 1986, Suzuki saved buyers money as the tax dropped to 24.4%. In the intervening year, Suzuki responded to European riders' complaints about the Bikea Euro 1 registered trademark S stability by lengthening the swing arm by an inch. With the groundwork laid by earlier, smaller bikes, Suzuki introduced the GSX-R 1100 in 1986. The technology mirrored that of the GSX-R 750 but added big bore power, 137 horsepower, to the mix while keeping the bike as light as possible, just 434 pounds. Model history: as motorcycles have evolved, perspectives on the GSX-R 1100 have changed. When the bike was new, magazines lauded its power, handling and relative lack of weight. But today's authors who compare it against 1994's introduction of the super sports bikes, driven by today Barber's development of the Honda Fireblade, can use 20/20 hindsight to be more critical. Recent articles, some with head-to-head comparisons with newer sport bikes, still rave about the powerful 1100cc's engine but otherwise describe the GSX-R 1100 as large, heavy, and unstable. Some of these assertions are borne out by Suzuki's year-to-year tinkering with the frame geometry in order to make the bike handle better. The result is that different years have different handling characteristics on the road. Earlier bikes are lighter but the square-section alloy frame is prone to warping under extreme stress. Later models are more rigid and offer increased power but suffer from increased weight. The original bikes had square-section alloy frames, 18-inch wheels front and rear and a large endurance-style fairing. The early version of the engine was 1052 cc's in capacity and with greater similarity to the 750 cc's than later versions. The frame was somewhat stiffer than the frame on the 750 Euro. Indeed, the box section is noticeably thicker when compared side to side. Handling was secure, but not particularly fast. The brakes consisted of 2 full floating discs at the front gripped by 2 Sumitomo 4-piston calipers and a small fixed disc gripped by a twin-piston caliper at the rear. Suzuki referred to this as the Deca piston setup. Over the 3 years of production there were only minor changes, the largest being the switch to heavier 3-spoke wheels on the last J model. The 1989 fitted the 1100 engine into a new heavier, shorter and stiffer frame based on the previous year's updated and extremely well-received GSX-R 750J. Magazine testers trying out the machines gave rave reviews but something was changed between then and the bike's going on sale. The Slingshot 1100K sold in the shop suffered handling problems. Some claimed as a result of changed geometry, others said there was nothing wrong with the frame and that it was the suspension units that were set up all wrong. Whatever it was, the standard bike was thought hard to handle, and many modern magazines go so far as to advise buyers to avoid the K model, some even calling that year a Euro e Limona Euro. This was an attitude that was reinforced with the death of the Suzuki racer Phil Mellor at the Isle of Man in 1989 on the GSX-R 1100K race bike. Jamie Wortham also crashed in the same race, and it was enough to see the race authorities at the IOM ban the big bikes from racing for several years. In 1990 the bike was again tweaked and the wheelbase lengthened to correct the previous year's handling problems. 1991 saw the addition of larger carburetors and major cosmetic changes when the fairing was reworked to place the headlights under a smooth plastic cover that helped the bike Euro unregistered trademark S aerodynamics. 1992 was mechanically the same but offered more aggressive graphics in line with the time. It was also the last year of the oil-cooled engines as the bike was redesigned for 1993. 1993 saw major engine changes with the introduction of water cooling and some significant chassis changes. The move away from oil cooling allowed a surge in power, bringing total output to 155 bhp at the crank, and saw yet another hugely strong, reliable and extremely tunable Suzuki engine created. A new stiffer largely forged five-sided pentagonal cross-section frame was introduced along with an asymmetrical banana swing arm. Bigger Nissan six-piston brake calipers were fitted. The bike Euro unregistered trademark S weight went up slightly as well, finally topping the 500-pound mark that Suzuki had been flirting with for years, but the overall look of the bike remained essentially the same as previous models. 1994 saw nothing but color changes. Throughout the water-cooled years, 1993 to 1998, the GSX-R Euro unregistered trademark S design saw only one relatively major revision with the launch of the 1995 WS. Everything else on the 1996 WT, 1997 WV and 1998 WW models was restricted to mere color and graphics changes. In keeping with the usual model development, this followed many of the same changes introduced to previous year's GSX-R 750WR. Minor but significant changes were made to the suspension, the ignition and the cams. The 1995 WS and onward models also featured a race-style braced swing arm. Overall peak power was unchanged, but the torque curve on the bike was much improved. From the 1995 models, weight fell back 221 kilograms in the UK market. Some aerodynamic modifications were also introduced. Many owners say these bikes are the easiest to live with and the most well-rounded. Good fuel economy is even possible, 15.9 km per litre, and the slight changes made to the footpeg position on the WS on models even made distances a much less daunting prospect. In reality, the bike had become a highly competent and monstrously fast sports touring machine, a far cry from its race-born origins. It is clear the design had reached its fullest form in the mid-1990s, but that in terms of the leading edge of sports bike design it was already outdated and left behind as competition spurred the development of ever more powerful, ever lighter sport bikes. This was demonstrated nowhere else more clearly than Suzuki's own brand new 1996 GSX-R 750 WT, a return to the ultra-lightweight with a new beam frame, the SRAD design, which offered approximately 115 bhp at the rear wheel, coupled with the added boost from the new pressurized airbox design. All at a chassis weight cost on the GSX-R 750 WT of only 179 kilograms. Clearly Suzuki were returning the GSX-Rs to their race-bred roots. Whilst Suzuki had clearly felt a great attachment to the cradle frame, it is an interesting irony that the GSX-R 250 and GSX-R 400 used an alloy beam frame in the four model years 1986 to 1989. 1998 saw the last GSX-R 1100S roll off the assembly line and, despite how popular the bike had been in its heyday, there was no hue and cry as production quietly stopped. Suzuki would be without a big bore sport bike for 3 years before the GSX-R 1000 was released. Despite the fact that over its production run tens of thousands of GSX-R 1100s were produced and sold all over the world, original examples in good condition have become something of a rarity. Many bikes were ridden hard and they were often crashed. As a result, they became and remain a popular starting point for street fighters and customs. The bike is a tuner's favorite, all versions respond well to tuning and even early models can make 140 horsepower at the wheel with relative ease. Simple intake modifications and a good exhaust will yield upwards of 10 horsepower increase. More enthusiastic tuning will see 160 horsepower or more, and many drag racers use superchargers or turbochargers with this engine to break the 500 horsepower mark. A modified version of the original oil-air-cooled 1100 engine was used in the original 1157cc's model of the Bandit 1200 motorcycle and taken to the biggest factory big bore job in the hugely torque-laden GSX 1400 up until 2008. References